We're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving Podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast. Hello, I'm your host, Zinnia. This is an ex-Christadelphian podcast created by and for individuals who have left the Christadelphian faith, and I do really mean that. The name was chosen by a poll among ex-Christadelphians, and all those voices you heard in our intro music are ex-Christadelphian voices. This podcast aims to share the stories of ex-Christadelphians from around the world through personal interviews and to also take an in-depth look at our shared history. I want to talk in this episode about what this podcast will be about, provide some background information on Christadelphians for anyone learning about them for the first time, and share some quick disclaimers. I know some people think history is boring, but I'm hoping you'll be open-minded about the history episodes, as I have found a lot of information that I think will really surprise you and has already made me laugh out loud and scream in shock. It should be a lot of fun, and I'm sure you'll hear something that you've never heard before. Like, did you know that John Thomas claims that he's hypnotized someone before? Did you know that some Christadelphians once did hands-on healing? Did you know that some Christadelphians don't believe anyone should read novels? No? Then you might enjoy our history episodes, where I'll share all the different wild things I've found while sifting through Christadelphian history, and none of those are even the facts that made me literally scream out loud because they were just so unexpected. So, why am I making this podcast? Well, there aren't a lot of spaces and resources for ex-Christadelphians. To be fair, there actually aren't a lot of us. From what I've been able to find, there is no exact census number for how many Christadelphians there even are, because there's such a small group with an only estimated 50,000 members worldwide. Based on these numbers, there's going to be an even smaller demographic of ex-Christadelphians spread across the globe. Unsurprisingly, given the small nature of this demographic, many ex-Christadelphians feel isolated when they leave, and they find that there are very few places to connect with each other and share resources. As far as I'm aware, this is the first podcast creating a space for ex-Christadelphians. And who am I? I was born a fifth-generation Christadelphian. I was baptized into the Christadelphian faith as a child, and then I left the sect in my early 20s. A few years after leaving, I found some research and resources that were created by ex-Christadelphians online, and that was really helpful for me. So a few more years passed, and I started down a rabbit hole just looking for some basic information about Christadelphian history. And I discovered that its history was a lot more interesting than I had expected, and it brought up a lot of questions rather than just answering the ones that I'd had when I began. I realized I hadn't really known anything about the group that I'd belonged to, except those theological essentials that were always discussed. I discovered a lot that I wanted to share with other ex-Christadelphians, and I didn't think making blogs or a website was the way I wanted to share that information. I felt making a podcast would be more accessible and fun for other people who, like me, had an interest as a former member. So I also have a background in researching niche history and writing engaging pieces on this history for publication in my free time. The first piece that was published that I wrote actually gave evidence that a 19th century history book had recorded some facts that were completely wrong. So critically analyzing history is something that I've been doing for a few years just for fun. And this is lucky for you, so that you can learn about this without having to read all these books from the 1800s like I've been doing. So as I was reading all these old Christadelphian books and articles, it became apparent that there's also not a lot of objective sources for Christadelphian history. Since it's a small group that has had limited reach throughout history, most of what is out there has been written by Christadelphians for Christadelphians. Because of this, a lot of omissions and half-truths were published that could hide or misrepresent the facts. So I've recognized in my reading that there's a need for organized, accessible, well-researched information with sources for people who want to learn about or critically examine Christadelphian dogma for themselves. I've personally found that having access to reliable, objective information can also help some people who are processing after they've left a religion. Leaving a religion is hard, so I'm going to share where I'm getting quotes from, and you're welcome to read the full sources on your own. The Christadelphians are a pretty insular group. So while this podcast is primarily creating a space for ex-Christadelphians, it's also probably going to be educational for those who just want to know more about the Christadelphians in general. The group is pretty obscure in the greater context of modern religion, so modern religious experts aren't really talking about the group or researching it. I believe that ex-Christadelphians are really the best equipped to look fairly objectively at this because they've been inside the group to see the dynamics, to learn about it, experience the culture firsthand. But now they're outside of that influence of the group. We have a more independent view that's not invested in defending, protecting the image and values they claim they hold, since we no longer identify as a member of the group. If you look online at Christadelphian podcasts, they're mostly just sharing their talks online, which they call exhortations, which doesn't actually tell you that much about where the sect came from, issues within the group, or what it's really like to be a member. After a while, they're also kind of all the same. You read some Bible verses, you talk about Jesus, you end with your solemn moment of silence before they return to their seat. So if you're curious about what it was like being a Christadelphian, what they believe, if you know or are dating a Christadelphian, or if you're just someone who's curious about the culture, beliefs, and traditions, this podcast could be a good starting place for you to learn more from firsthand accounts as well as the historical references. So for those listeners who may be joining us here who are unfamiliar with the Christadelphians, I'll share a short background on who they are and some terminology that you'll want to know. The Christadelphians are a small religion who meet in small congregations called ecclesias worldwide. An ecclesia could be as small as a single family, or maybe perhaps up to 100 or so members. A formal member is someone who chose to be immersed in water for an adult baptism. Despite being called an ecclesia, they will usually say they are going to meeting rather than to the ecclesia. They tell others that they are trying to practice Christianity as it was practiced by the early disciples in the first century ecclesias. And they try to be in the world, but not of it. So there's a bit of a withdrawn way of engaging to the world inherent in that. Different families may limit their activities based on their interpretation of what is too worldly. Their religious services are held on Sunday mornings, and the services rely heavily on reading the Bible, singing hymns, saying prayers, and a male baptized member will give a talk to the audience, which they call the exhortation. During the service, you'll typically hear them talk about Jesus dying for the sins of humanity and about his impending return to the world to destroy it and rebuild a new kingdom. They ceremonially partake of his symbolic flesh and blood every Sunday with unleavened bread and wine. They are anxiously awaiting Jesus' return. They may also have programs such as an evening Bible study or youth group activities that are held during the week. A youth group is often called CYC, which is short for Christadelphian Youth Circle. They are not generally known for their charity work, and their primary activities with the world outside the ecclesia is generally just spreading their beliefs by preaching to gain new members. However, most of their members in established ecclesias are actually born into the group. Some have joined as a result of a flirt to convert method where the relationship was made acceptable after their significant other joined through baptism. This is important since relationships between baptized Christadelphians with non-Christadelphians, or even just unbaptized Christadelphians, can be frowned upon, and it can cause penalties or even dismissal from the group. If you are dismissed from the group, that is called being disfellowshipped. People who leave are said to be out in the world, which has a negative connotation within the group, and the undertones are that they are then affiliated with sin and wickedness. The Christadelphians are distinctive for their views on baptism, which occurs when an adult chooses to be baptized after an eligibility exam by older members of the ecclesia. They are also known for their head coverings or hats worn by the baptized female members. Baptized members call each other brother or sister, and children in the ecclesia refer to these baptized adults as uncle or aunt. Don't come after me. Problems that arise in the Christadelphian community are primarily addressed by their leadership team of male baptized members called the Arranging Board, or ABs for short. As I mentioned earlier, Christadelphians are avid Bible readers, and they may show you their King James Version Bible with markings on the wide margins with notes that they took. The group actually promotes a method of Bible reading called the Bible Companion, which encourages members to read several chapters of their Bible every day. If they follow this program, they'll read the Old Testament in its entirety every year, and the New Testament twice in a year. As a fun fact, I did read the entire Bible before using this method, so it does work. I was in middle school, probably about 12, and let's just say I was as popular at school as you would think I would be with that pastime. So yeah, that should catch you up on some terminology that you'll hear in this podcast series and help you understand the basic structures and organizations in an ecclesia if you are new to learning about the Christadelphians. As a disclaimer, I am not a therapist trained in religious drama, and this podcast is not intended as a replacement for counseling. We also don't have PhDs in religious studies or theology. I am just someone who researches history for fun, enjoys building community, and has been encouraged by the ex-Christadelphian community to create this podcast. I'll also not be trying to reinterpret the Bible to challenge Christadelphian theology. I will leave that to other Christians who will happily write blogs arguing and debating theology with them. You can believe whatever the hell you want to believe. I'm just providing some resources so that you can be well informed around this belief system. I'm also going to use the term the Christadelphians a lot, but I do acknowledge that every individual is unique. Generally, I'm referring to the historical or official stance on subjects, so there may be some Christadelphians that differ somewhat on particulars. I'm also sure that some Christadelphians will listen to this podcast because people are curious and protective of things they identify with. Being a Christadelphian is definitely an identity, so I'm sure that some people will be upset that this podcast that doesn't reinforce their identity simply exists. But at the same time, sharing historical information from 100 to 200 years ago doesn't seem very controversial, especially when most of it was written by Christadelphians for Christadelphians. So if there are some Christadelphians who can tolerate being uncomfortable, then you're welcome to be here and listen to a different perspective, learn something new. However, this is your official warning to any Christadelphians who are feeling curious that you don't have to listen to this podcast, and that I take no responsibility for any Christadelphian who has a crisis of faith if they choose to listen to this podcast and something causes you to feel doubt. It is your choice, and you are not the target audience for this podcast. You will probably not like something that you hear in this space. I'm aware that ex-Christadelphians are just Christadelphians who took one more step in their religious path, and they made the choice to step off that path that had been laid out for them. But that was our choice to make as adults, and as an individual, you get to choose your own beliefs too. I'm not going to tell anyone to stay or leave their religious group. I believe that choice is only theirs to make either way, and the choice to listen to these stories on the podcast is also yours to make as well. The last thing I want to say in this podcast is that we are going to debunk the notion that people who leave the Christadelphians are these lost sheep. When I was a member, I heard this a lot about anyone who stopped attending. It was also said as though people were just lazy, forgetful, or so sinful that they turn their back on going to meetings, that they can go live a sinful life. There was a lot of shaming of people who left. And then I never saw or heard from them again. So that left me without anything to disprove what we had been told about them. But ex-Christadelphians just made a choice to leave. We didn't forget to attend. We did something hard, and we did it on our own. Since leaving, most of us have been told that we're sinners, we have no hope for the future, and I'm here to say that that's not true. Once you start listening, you'll realize that ex-Christadelphians are finding themselves and creating a future out there in the world. We're finding our people, choosing our beliefs, and exploring our hope and passion and joy. I'm creating this platform that will show everyone the strength, hope, and grit of these people who made the choice to leave and to trust themselves over someone else's truth. Even if you're not there yet, you can see from others that it's possible to get there with time. We're also smart, funny, and gorgeous, so we're an awesome group of people to hang out with. It's time to create a space of our own where we can tell our stories and share our experiences with people who are struggling. We can talk openly about problems we face and have a resource that's easy to find and share. So, I hope you'll join us in supporting this community. In our first episode, we'll begin with the origin of the Christadelphians and of Dr. John Thomas. From there, I'll be choosing different topics to do historical deep dives on. I'll also be regularly sharing interviews with ex-Christadelphians, discussing their personal experiences leaving the group and their journey after leaving. I hope that this collection of first-hand stories and deep dives into history will encourage those who have already left and those who are currently in the process of leaving to find comfort, to help them critically think about their once deeply held beliefs, and to help find community with others who have also been through this. If you'd like to join the ex-Christadelphian community, please request to join the group on Facebook at the group called A Group for Ex-Christadelphians. This Facebook group was founded in 2008 for ex-Christadelphians and is quite active with new members joining regularly. If you're an ex-Christadelphian who would like to share your story on the podcast, please send an email to LifeAfterLeavingPodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us, and if you like this podcast, please share it with a friend. We'll be back soon with more of the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast.